Hello and welcome to another episode of Kanada Mit C, or in English, Canada with a C. My name is Annika Wekinis. I'm the project manager of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Canada. A country's capacity to innovate is a fundamental driver for economic growth and social prosperity. Turning a novel idea into a commercial or social value is what enables new businesses to emerge, communities to thrive, and economies to sustain a competitive advantage. It is also key for enhancing the standard of living and well-being of a nation. The world today, however, faces changing economic outlook amidst shifting social, trade, and environmental prospects, as well as the COVID-19 pandemic. In this episode, we will focus on digital innovation in Canada and some of the challenges that the country faces when it comes to addressing the rural and urban digital divide, data governance, cybersecurity, disinformation on social media, and building an innovation ecosystem in Canada. Our distinguished guest of today's episode, who will offer his expertise on this topic and provide some insights into these challenges, is Mr. Aaron Shull. Mr. Shull is the Managing Director and General Counsel for the Center for International Governance Innovation, or in short, CIGI. He acts as a strategic liaison between CIGI's research initiatives and other departments while managing CIGI's legal affairs and advising senior management on a range of legal, operational, and policy matters. Prior to joining CIGI, Mr. Shull practiced law for a number of organizations, focusing on international regulatory and environmental law. He has taught courses at the Faculty of Law at the University of Ottawa and the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs. He was also staff editor for the Columbia Journal of Transnational Law. Mr. Shull is an expert on cybersecurity issues. He coordinated the CIGI essay series governing cyberspace during a crisis in trust. In his introduction, he argues that more robust international norms for cybersecurity are a national imperative for Canada. Without further ado, today's interview will be conducted by Dr. Norbert Eschborn, Director of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung Canada. Norbert, over to you now.
Mr. Shull, thank you very much for joining us today. How would you describe and evaluate Canada's current innovation performance in comparison to Germany and other G7 countries?
Well, it's a good question, and it's a pleasure to be with you today. So thank you very much for the invitation. I think as a starting point, Canada, we invest very, very heavily in innovation. There are over 60 federal programs, that's 60 federal programs delivered through 17 government departments and agencies, totaling more than $5 billion in annual expenditures targeting research and development alone. Now, these investments rely mainly on supply-side economics, things like tax credits, to incentivize innovation. So to compare against Germany and others, according to a 2021 World Intellectual Property Organization Global Innovation Index, Canada ranks 16th. So we're keeping company with countries like Austria, Ireland, Japan, and Norway, but behind emerging market powerhouses like China, the United States, UK, South Korea, and Singapore. And Germany in that same index ranked 10th. So this score considers science and innovation investments, technological progress, short and long-term socioeconomic impact. Now, Canada, we're doing okay. We perform relatively well at the beginning of the innovation chain in basic research and starting companies. But we perform relatively poorly in the later stages, such as scaling small and medium-sized enterprises into global firms in non-protected and regulated sectors of the economy, and in late-stage capital financing. So the issue for Canada is not putting money into research and development. The issue for us is actually scaling innovative companies onto the global stage.
In the mandate letter to the Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry, François-Philippe Champagne, the need for all Canadians to have the tools to fully participate in and benefit from the digital economy was emphasized. However, Canadians pay among the highest internet prices in the world, yet there are many rural communities in Canada without broadband access. How do you explain Canada's rural versus urban digital divide and how to address digital poverty?
Well, it's a good question. And actually, as one of those Canadians who pays astronomical prices for cell phones and internet access, this is an issue that is close to my heart. I think the COVID-19 pandemic has really brought into sharper focus this issue of a digital divide, both in its socioeconomic terms and its geographic terms. The lack of universally accessible, affordable, reliable, scalable broadband infrastructure in this country represents a generational policy failure. We have heard repeated promises to connect everyone in Canada to this critical infrastructure and to build communities' capacity to realize the social and economic benefits of connectivity. And we know that it's a matter of equity, but we still have a way to go. So really, what can be done? Well, there's a few things that can be done. First, we need to create equitable access to digital devices and digital services in this country. Number two, we need reliable, consistent, and affordable broadband and cellular services. And number three, we need to make sure that there's education and support so that people really understand how to take advantage of the digital economy. And there's a few specifics around this. If we could create a policy to help increase reliable and affordable rural internet access, including competitive internet and mobile prices, fund community research about the digital divide to guide policy goals and to measure success, and actually to look at how you've done. So not only to put in place policy frameworks, but really then to issue accountability reports. If we're going to set a policy trajectory to bridge that digital divide, we need to action it. But then we also need to issue accountability reports to determine whether or not we've met those goals.
Data is being hailed as the new oil. The analogy seems appropriate, given the growing amount of data being collected and the advances made in its gathering, storage, manipulation, and use for commercial, social, and political purposes. What is the Canadian government doing regarding data governance, and what are some of the challenges?
Sure. I mean, I'm not a big fan of analogizing data to anything. I've heard of it called the new oil. I've also heard it called the new plutonium. So there's, I think it's safe to say that there's inherent power in data. The question is how you govern it. And so the post-pandemic world will surely be one that's more data-driven than the lives we had before. And our country in Canada urgently needs a national data strategy that is able to appropriately harness the economic benefits that can flow from data, but also mitigating the harm. And these are two sides of the same coin. Let me explain. So Canada has attempted to lay the foundation for governing data and the data sphere, trying to rebuild citizen trust and spur innovation through various plans. We've got the digital charter. There's currently, or at least there was in the previous parliament, an attempt to modernize Canada's Privacy Act. We've got an intellectual property strategy, a national cybersecurity strategy, a pan-Canadian AI strategy, an innovation and skills plan. So data governance is present in all of these, but the point here is that it's horizontal, it's cross-cutting in nature. And so the question then becomes, how do we make sure that we're appropriately governing data? So we have to answer a few questions in our system. Who owns the data, and what do these data rights entail? Who is allowed to collect what data? What are the rules for data aggregation? What are the rules for data transfer? And then if we talk about the social good, what are the mental health issues, especially for youth? What is the impact of surveillance capitalism? How do we protect vulnerable groups? How do we use surveillance for legitimate public safety purposes to avoid undermining democratic rights and freedoms? And how do we enhance regulation and monitoring of political messaging and advertising? And that's all in the domestic context. But then, of course, there's a global level of governance here, too, that needs to be addressed. So what should the international rules governing trade of data be? How do we make sure that there's sovereign choices in terms of data governance? What is the flexibility to preserve? What flexibility needs to be preserved to allow for the ongoing utilization and innovation, and to say nothing of global cyber norms? And so all that to say that data is a complex policy issue. It is one that is inherently horizontal in nature, and it's one, I would say, that in Canada, our governance framework is still in its infancy. To be honest with you, it's being worked out board as we're having this conversation, and we need to do better in this country. And to be fair, we could actually look to Europe as a bit of an example in terms of the way that they've structured their GDPR or General Data Directive. So there's examples in Europe that are quite good.
According to Canada's Cyber Defense Agency, ransomware attacks in Canada have been increasingly targeting critical infrastructure providers such as the Canadian health, energy and manufacturing sectors. Can you please explain why this is happening and what the costs are for the Canadian economy if this issue remains unresolved? How to make organizations and institutions more resilient and less prone to cyber threats?
We're at a precarious moment in history where the rapid growth of interconnectivity is matched with the proliferation of cyber weapons. And I think there's a few reasons behind this. Number one is that the international rules around cyber weapons are not very good. They're quite opaque. They're a bit hard to interpret, and they're antiquated. I mean, when you talk about the international rules that apply to cyber weapons, typically people will start with the UN Charter that was written before there was computers. And so we've got state actors launching major attacks. But the other part is that the barriers to entry for criminal enterprises are surprisingly low. Malicious cyber attack techniques are actually sold online at a relatively small fee, meaning that the attack mechanism can be bought and deployed by anyone. You don't even need to be technically sophisticated. While this is happening, we've also built dependencies all through our economic model and through our critical infrastructure system. And the other point that I would raise is that a lot of countries talk about making sure that we don't use malicious exploits aimed at others' critical infrastructure, when the actual opposite is true in terms of state practice. Many countries are moving in cyberspace to load other states' critical infrastructure with malicious cyber exploits, not to necessarily be deployed at the present, but to be deployed in the future in the event of some form of a conflict. All that to say that this is incredibly dangerous and it's incredibly costly. And with respect to criminal actors in particular using malicious cyber attacks and principally ransomware attacks for the furtherance of their criminal enterprise, it's just inherently unfair. Really what's happening is that criminal actors are stealing things that don't belong to them. And they're able to do so because it's very, very difficult to prosecute across borders. It's difficult to catch them. And when it comes to state actors, they're using a gray zone in terms of the international rules to pursue malicious activity in cyberspace. So we're at a very, very precarious point in our history right now. I would say it's destabilizing. I would say that it's undermining trust in the system. And I would say that it's also incredibly dangerous.
The University of Toronto's Citizen Lab released a report declaring, and I quote, "Canada does not have a Huawei problem per se. Instead, it stated, and I quote again, we have a much bigger 5G strategy problem stemming from a lack of cooperation between government telecom companies and manufacturers of 5G-enabled equipment to ensure that Canada's emerging 5G networks are safe from cyber attacks," end quote. What is your view on the challenges of the 5G rollout and how should Canada deal with the risks involved?
So, I mean, it's a good question. And I'll be the first to say that I'm not security cleared. And so this is just my own opinion. I don't have access to any of the information on which government security agencies would have made these assessments, but I do read the assessments that are coming from colleagues in government. And so there's two aspects, or maybe three aspects that we need to talk about. One is the security risk. The second is the economic risk. And the third is how do we implement 5G in the country? So, I mean, it's clear that security agencies are concerned, and I have to be deferential to them. I've looked at the public statements from the Canadian Security Intelligence Service. I've also reviewed the public statements from the Communications Security Establishment. These are the two principal government agencies that would address the security concerns. And they've been clear in their discourse that there are legitimate security concerns present. In addition to that, three of Canada's partners in the Five Eyes intelligence sharing alliance, the United States, Britain, and Australia have taken steps to keep Huawei out of their 5G networks. And so that's the operating context. The security agencies are indicating that there's a clear security concern, and Canada's closest allies and their most sacred of intelligence sharing arrangements have also expressed a concern. So I'll be deferential there. The economic issue is that if we're not going to use 5G equipment provided from Huawei into our ecosystem, then our telecom firms will have to pay more money, likely, for that infrastructure. And so Bell and TELUS, our major providers in this country, will have to look at alternative arrangements to provide that infrastructure. But finally, I would say that if we're looking at economic security, we have to be mindful of the fact that there is, to a degree, an adversarial relationship with China. Our intelligence services have been very clear along the way, and that the concern that they're enumerating is that this is critical infrastructure, and that there is an adversarial relationship with China at times, and that it would be a precarious relationship to be able to build that sensitivity into the core of our economic model, into the core of our digital ecosystem, into the core of our digital economy. So the idea is to keep our networks safe and to keep our networks secure, but also to empower Canadians. And so the concern, as I'd said, was set out by the security agencies, and I need to be deferential because I just don't have access to the classified material that they would be reviewing to make those assessments.
Political disinformation and foreign interference in national elections have become problems in a number of countries. What are some of the experiences that Canada has made in this regard, and what efforts have been undertaken to combat disinformation and interferences from abroad?
So I think the starting point for your listeners is that Canada's elections are highly transparent. So Ottawa has openly informed the public about election threats, even as other nations are reluctant to do so. The Communications Security Establishment, which I referred to earlier, that's Canada's national cryptological agency. They first started to share public threat assessments in the summer of 2017. The first threat assessment, updated before the 2019 federal election, provided voters and political campaigns with an overview of the challenges that Canada faced. Canada is also taking concrete steps to secure its elections. Elections Canada, which is the body that implements elections around the country, has improved its information technology to strengthen critical election infrastructure. In addition, it has trained election administration personnel to reduce the vulnerability of human assets in the democratic process. They often say the most vulnerable part of cyberspace is the 18 inches between the user's eyes and the screen. Oftentimes, part of the exploit is largely because users don't know how to protect themselves, and so they've taken steps to do that. And Elections Canada, for example, works with the communications or with the Canadian Security Intelligence Service and the Communications Security Establishment to identify threats, emerging tactics, and systemic vulnerabilities. So there's a whole of government approach, which also includes various other federal departments, which makes it easier to prepare for and to respond to threats of foreign interference. In the same spirit, we also work internationally. So government agencies at the front line of combating foreign interference, such as Global Affairs Canada and the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, have formed a task force to facilitate a more effective common response. And lastly, we've also put in place a critical election incident protocol. And so the protocol itself has a very limited mandate, but in the event that there is an issue with foreign interference, a public announcement will be made during the election if there was an incident or incidents that have threatened Canada's ability to have a free and fair election. And then we also participate in the G7 rapid response mechanism. So we have these mechanisms in place to make sure that Canada can have safe, secure, and fair elections.
What impact does social media have on political outcomes? And what trends have you observed when it comes to voting behavior?
Well, targeting, reach, and amplification. Those are the main facets that we're talking about when we're talking about social media. Targeting, reach, and amplification. And if it's misinformation that's being targeted, has an increased reach and an increased amplification, we have a real problem. So misinformation has proven to be one of the most powerful tools in the game of interference, influencing the masses that are unable to tell the difference between real and doctored content. Spreading disinformation and misinformation on social media can be used to undermine the will of people to vote, where, when, and how to vote, the reliability of the electoral process, or to promote artificially inflate the unpopularity of certain political parties, candidates, issues, public figures, to influence an election outcome, and effectively to try and paralyze democracy by fueling fragmentation, polarization, spreading confusion, uncertainty about the fact-based reality, and undermining trust and integrity in the democratic process and in institutions. So in answer to your question, social media, if not properly checked, can have a major outcome or a major impact on outcomes by virtue of doing that, by virtue of increasing targeting, increasing the reach, and increasing the amplification of misinformation and disinformation. With respect to trends, I mean, this is something where we're looking at it in detail, but the problem's about to get worse. Deep fakes are going to make this problem much worse. So deep fake, for the benefit of your listeners, is an AI-generated video forgery that can enable anyone to generate a video of, say, a politician and literally put words in their mouth. And so this technology can be used to affect the way that the public perceives a candidate and ultimately disrupt the voting process. And as an example, in May 2019, there was a misleading deepfake that depicted U.S. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi as being impaired, creating a convincing deception about a person in power stuttering through their speech. So the reach and the potential impact is clear. And I would just say that the trend lines are not helpful in the sense that it's only going to get more sophisticated. And if not adequately governed, the impact can be much more profound and much more serious.
As we have said, disinformation on social media is rampant. How have large-scale disinformation campaigns been harmful to the COVID-19 vaccine rollout, and how to address them?
Well, it's a good question. And in some ways, I'd like to come back to you in 2 years from now and answer it because we just don't know yet. But I think it's safe to say that the COVID-19 pandemic has been accompanied by an infodemic of false information and conspiracy theories since the virus first emerged nearly 2 years ago. The World Health Organization listing vaccine hesitancy as one of the top 10 threats to the world. The spread of false information on far-reaching social media platforms like Twitter and Facebook is a legitimate and urgent cause for concern. China and Russia, for example, have been known to push disinformation and propaganda about the origins of the virus, have spread unproven cures for the disease, and the efficacy of vaccines aimed at winning over foreign audiences and sowing distrust toward Western governments. So all that to say that this is a major issue, and it's this dynamic interplay between public health and social media, and disinformation and the desire of adversarial states to try and undermine confidence in public health measures. And this is exceedingly dangerous. And because of this, people will die. And I feel as though it's an incredibly dangerous game that we're playing. It's short-sighted, it's destabilizing, and it's incredibly dangerous. So there isn't a silver bullet to eliminate the COVID-19 disinformation kind of infodemic that's become so prominent online, but we need to think through the ways that we're going to govern social media companies. And we need to make sure that our governments are enabled to do everything possible to chip away at this problem. So it goes back to what we were talking about. This is ultimately a data governance problem. How do we choose to deal with data? How do we choose to deal with social media companies? I mean, it certainly can't be the status quo where we let these infodemics run wild because we're playing a dangerous game with people's lives.
What can be done to future-proof the Canadian economy and build an innovation ecosystem in Canada?
It's another good question. We talked earlier about intellectual property. So policymakers, we need to adopt new policies to reflect the incredible potential of intellectual property as one of the most powerful innovation assets in what we call the intangibles economy. The economy previously used to be about plants, bricks, mortar, trucks, production facilities, and factories. When the driver of wealth now is intellectual property and data, the most valuable country or the most valuable companies in the world, the bulk of their value is the intangible assets, those things one cannot touch: intellectual property, brands, and data. So governments need to understand the economic value of intellectual property. And so our current policy framework puts Canada at a disadvantage globally when it comes to intellectual property and commercialization. When it comes to economic potential, those two things plus data, that's everything. So Canadian technology firms attempting to scale up globally need a strong relationship with the government to build the dynamic environment in which they can thrive. Canada, as I said earlier, doesn't have a startup problem. Rather, we have a scale-up problem. And we need to look at intellectual property in tandem with data. So we need to have high standards for privacy. We need to allow digital platforms to thrive in an ecosystem where data governance is defined, where it's strong, where it's robust, and where we've got a framework that allows companies to commercialize intellectual property, to understand the value of data, to protect privacy, and to scale globally.
If you were part of the Canadian government and you were in a position to introduce new policies, what steps would you take to make Canada a leader in today's data-driven digital global economy?
Well, I do two things. So I'm going to use an example of hockey. What interview with a Canadian person would be complete without a reference to hockey? So there was a great Canadian hockey player by the name of Wayne Gretzky. He was one of the greatest of a generation. And they asked him, why was he so good? And the answer that came back was because Mr. Gretzky skated to where the puck was going to be, not to where the puck was presently. And so the question is, what is the next big issue that we need to address? And that is quite simply outer space governance. I think many of the issues we're talking about, critical infrastructure, is actually going to move into outer space. And so to make sure that we're on top of that, to make sure that we've got a framework in place to take advantage of the booming space economy and the many, many opportunities, as well as the many challenges that are going to be presented in terms of space governance. The second issue is making sure that we've allowed for our companies to grow, scale, and access commercial markets. And the problem we have in this country is we don't tend to pick winners. We spread the money around to various incubators and hope all will thrive. The reality is we need to pick the companies that we think are going to win in the global market and then get behind them. There was an example from the Olympics where Canada did well in the Olympics. It's because they instituted a policy called Own the Podium. And what that was they identified the athletes and the sports that we thought we could actually win at, and then we put resources behind them rather than seeing how Canada would do in sports where we're traditionally weak or where we wouldn't score well or where there wasn't a domestic ecosystem. So the point here is lean into the world. Where's the puck going to be? Outer space. Number two is make sure that you've got the grit and the will to pick who you think is going to win in the global market and then get behind them as national champions. We have to own the podium, but need to do so in the intangibles economy, the IP-driven or intellectual property-driven economy, and the data-driven economy.
Thank you, Aaron Shull, for being our guest today.
Thank you very much, Norbert. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Kanada Mit C on the topic of digital innovation in Canada. If you would like to watch the previous episodes or learn more about the work of the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung here in Canada, please have a look at our homepage and social media. Thank you and goodbye.